trying to understand whether marriage is a sacrament or marriage is a contract. So in the first part of the lecture, we try to understand how Hindu marriage is kind of more sacramental. Traditional Hindu marriage was kind of sacramental. And now we're trying to understand how marriage is contractual, or what does it mean when we say that marriage is a contract. So when marriage is regarded as a union between man and a woman, as a secular and a civil union based on the knowing. So here basically the whole idea of consent comes in. So in the earlier traditional society, the consent of individual was not significant. So the union could also take between a person who was of unsound mind. So they were kind of if a woman was married to a man of unsound mind, it would be considered as marriage. And then if we kind of understand traditional Hindu society, where it was described in such a way that it was kind of considered that the husband is considered as a god, and then all the kind of activity was in a traditional patriarchal society was in relation to the subordinate status of women. So therefore there was a kind of an understanding that as society is moving on, as it is progressing, and the idea of individual progress, the idea of individual liberty becomes significant, the argument was that we need to understand marriage not as a sacrament or a union between two communities, two groups, but to kind of understand that it is a union between two individuals. So one thing which is very important when we look into marriage as a contract is to understand the concept of consent. That is, the individual as partners are giving consent to the union. So we have also heard in many kind of a society where negotiation of marriage happened, and the individual whose marriage was being negotiated had no idea. So it was the parents or it was the community which was arranging or negotiating the union. So consent was more or less absent in terms of individual consent. Yes, community consent was there, but individual had not much say, and many a time the acceptance of partner was kind of even evident in the behavior, that if it was kind of arranged by parents, for example say dowry, the man would not accept his wife, and therefore the kind of the marriage would never be consummated. Also that kind of an conflict or difference of opinion was part of society. But then when we look into as a contract where individual consent is being given for the union, even then differences and conflicts are part of it. So concept of marriage as a contract is considered as an outcome of industrial revolution. So kind of expand on this is the whole idea that I just said, that as society kind of becomes more scientific, more rational, and the whole idea is that we are moving from a religious, superstitious society to a more rational, bureaucratic, scientific society. Therefore, every action that we kind of do should have a kind of a rational, logical explanation. So the individual would kind of enter into a union with another, had to have a rational explanation, and that was if the two people kind of are getting together well or kind of understand each one other's perspective. So individual consent becomes a kind of a part of rational scientific outgrowth of industrial revolution. Theories of change compared Western industrial society to regarding marriage as contracts. It was based on individual consent and freedom. This is a kind of something that we already try to understand when we look into the social theory of social change and transformation. And there is a kind of an understanding, or theories were kind of being done in terms of comparison, in terms of comparing the Western model with the Eastern society. So we kind of had an understanding that what was happening in the Western Occident society was considered as to be better. So the Eastern Orientalist society had to kind of do what was happening in the West, and in the sense that if Western society was more towards looking at marriage as a contract, then it was believed that even societies in like India, which was in its step towards progress in terms of doing industrialization and improving, So in that context, it was assumed that if you are kind of entering into a marriage without knowing your partner, was you kind of labeled as being traditional or labeled as being kind of not very progressive and modernity. So the whole idea that then individuals started questioning the whole idea. Marriages were not then negotiated by parents and community, but individuals started kind of taking a say in it and say that individual consent was very important. Therefore, it kind of that comparison between the Western society and the Eastern society became very crucial. So marriage as a contract was became regarded as a mark of modernity and progress. So we know that when economy and political changes are taking place, it has a kind of a direct repercussion on the social institution. And especially in India, if we kind of look into the debates on modernity, we know that it was kind of considered as a mark of civilization, that if you are more progressive, you are kind of more westernized, you are more modern, then you would not kind of go on with certain practices which was labeled as tradition. And in that context, marriage as sacrament was considered as tradition, and the kind of a rejection of it and shift towards marriage as a contract. So and within that whole idea of industrial revolution and modernity coming in, we also see a lot of amendments happening. And one of the amendment which is very important to understand marriage is the amendment to Hindu Marriage Act 1955 and the Special Marriage Act 1954. Now both of these marriage rules were kind of amended according to the English law. So as I already said, that whatever changes were happening in India was in terms of from a colonial lens and was being done with reference to what was happening in Western society, mainly UK. So the English marriage law was taken as a model, and there was a kind of lot of changes to the Hindu marriage law. And it was kind of a idea that this amendment shifts marriage to a kind of a contractual agreement, and there was inclusion of special provisions like freely and voluntary entered by party. So the idea of consent comes in. It was kind of stating clearly in the law that the union had to be freely and voluntary entered by parties who have full knowledge of what they are doing. So the whole idea of the insane mind, or if you are not kind of mentally well, moves out. So it have to be that people who are giving consent are aware of the fact that they are kind of entering into an union. And therefore it also has the third element, which is that such union could be terminated on recognizable ground by the court. So these elements kind of took marriage towards a contract. In this, when we look into marriage as a contract, we see that it is voidable and may be annulled on the ground that marriage has not been consummated owing to the importance of the respondent. So the whole idea of consuming marriage or kind of having a sexual relation between the partner was become very important. And when we look into the law, and what even Patricia Oberoi is doing in her essay is trying to understand that how non-consummation of the marriage became a ground for terminating the marriage, and therefore it is kind of why was it becomes important, because it is considered as a breach of contract. So here is the relevant of marriage as a contract, in the sense if it is kind of entered for a certain purpose and both the individuals are giving consent, and if they have given a consent for certain purpose and they are not kind of doing it, so it can be annulled or kind of brought to an end, terminated on the ground that both the parties did not follow the contract. Now we try to understand the Muslim marriage, or how is Muslim marriage more kind of close to being a contract than the Hindu marriage. So when we look into marriage among Muslims, we see it's a kind of the objective is to bring order of domestic life, procreation of children and racial perpetuation. This is more or less similar for most of the society. But what is important is to consider when we compare Muslim marriages to Hindu marriages, we see the elements of contract are more in terms of a Muslim marriage. And we know there are two types of marriages among the Muslims, the nikah and the muta. More common is nikah. And when we understand nikah, the woman comes and lives with her husband, which is a with patri-viri local residence, because kind of a patrilineal descent, and the children belong to her husband's clan. So this is a complete illustration of a patrilineal, patri-viri local residence. But when we look into the idea of contract, we see that this union, which is kind of entered, can be brought to an end, and therefore this is one difference between the Hindu marriage, or as described in the traditional Hindu marriage rule, and Muslim is that in the Hindu marriage the marriage union was considered as permanent, so it could not be dissolved. Here it could be dissolved, and there is a provision of kind of the divorce, or what is called as talaq. And when we kind of understand, the second element of contract is a formal document is kind of signed by both the parties who are entering into a contract, or those who are entering into the marriage, and this document is known as nikah nama. So both individual kind of puts on the signature, so that kind of the element of consent is here. So two elements comes in very important. One is the consent of individual entering into a contract. The number two is that it can be, it's not a kind of a permanent union, it can be terminated. So next is that when we kind of see the third element is that there is a certain amount of payment which is done. Now payment is also part of Hindu marriage in the form of dowry, but here the payment is in terms that it kind of is returned back to the women as her legitimate pay money, if in the case the marriage is brought to an end. So that makes it again a kind of feature takes close to contract. The second form of marriage is muta, which is a union brought about by mutual consent of the parties. The contract is stipulated for a specific period. The marriage can be terminated after a short period, sometime lasting only for a few days. So in kind of explanation in terms of, if we look into the sacrament or the religious element, it is said that the Islam or in Quran, it is kind of not considered as a very viable form of marriage. So the most common is in terms of nikah. So the element of contract is kind of dominates in Muslim marriages. Now when we kind of look into, so we've understood marriage as sacrament, which is the Hindu marriage, and we've understood marriage as contract. Now what is the second objective of today's lecture is to understand whether the changes in the marriage in India is kind of signifying or giving us the idea that there is a shift from sacrament to contract. And we know that social change or transformation has been on a very high rate in India, and we are all aware of the large scale transformation which started happening in with the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and then coming in of democratization, modernization, with the colonial rule kind of spreading education, and a lot of social reform movements coming in, whereby there was a kind of emancipation movement for women. So the child marriage was kind of being questioned, the practices of widow, where they were kind of supposed to stay separate, or they were supposed to shave off their hair, they was not supposed to wear colored dresses. All these kind of reform movements was part of it, and within those changes, therefore, we can see how the institution of marriage was undergoing change. So in theory or in social sciences, we see that the factors, all these changes was kind of taking place because of the impact of Western culture, and we can use the term westernization. So a lot of changes in terms of social relation, in terms of gender relation, in terms of marriage practices were taking place because of the impact of Western society, because of enactment of new social legislations, and then media became very significant. Media played an important role in kind of speeding the rate of social change, and then we kind of also have a shift towards urbanization. So all these factors together brought about a lot of changes in the institution of marriage, and therefore now we kind of also look into in terms of whether marriage, the role that it was playing earlier is kind of changing. So today marriages take place not only for performing religious duties, but also for obtaining love and companionship. So the shift from, and this is a larger scale shift, and there's a lot of terms like Gemeinschaft, Gesellschaft, the shift from community to association, the kind of society shifting towards individualism, the decline of community feeling. So within this, when we see that this increase in individualism, marriage is no longer considered as a community activity. It is not necessarily considered as something which was done for the family or for the community, but it is now considered as something which is more importance is in questions of companionship, the idea of economic independence and financial stability, also in terms of looking into emotional support. So the changes in terms of we perceive the institution of marriage has certainly undergone. Now let us see what changes have happened in the Hindu Marriage Act 1955. And as I already said, that the Hindu Marriage Act was brought about changes, and it had a large consequence on matrimonial concept of Hindu, especially in terms of the Hindu marriage, understanding of Hindu marriage as a sacrament. So the real force behind the sacramental character was the concept of indissolubility and the fulfillment of personal duty imposed by religious faith. So this again kind of tells us that when we look into the traditional marriage, Hindu marriage law, the focus of it was that it was supposed to be considered as a permanent, it was considered to be a personal duty, individual duty, and third, it was considered to be a religious institution. Now the Hindu Marriage Act 1955 kind of diluted the act and brought in the provision of divorce. So they brought in the whole idea of annulment, that if in case it has not been kind of consumed or the purpose for which the union has been done is not achieved, the union can come to an end. So the Hindu Marriage Act permits divorce on various grounds of adultery, cruelty, unsoundness of mind, mutual consent, etc. So when we look into the ground on which divorce are kind of allowed, then it also takes a shift towards the individual behavior in terms of the individual attitude to the union. So if it is not kind of considered as full of faith or not true to your marital partner, there was a scope of kind of a divorce to take place, whereas this was not so in the earlier times when it was a completely sacramental thing. So maybe the kind of your partner may not have been a sound mind, but it could be married, the girl would have been married to a rich family, so the unsoundness or the mental health of the spouse did not matter, and there was no question of going to the court and filing divorce. So it continues as it was. So that is why it is kind of said that when the element of divorce comes in, the idea of marriage as a permanent union starts kind of shaking. This act also lays down restitution of conjugal rights in cases of desertion. So there are various elements which has been introduced in the new act. It has been observed that the sacrament nature of a Hindu marriage under the act has been diluted to a great extent. There are three areas where the dilution can be observed. First is by recognizing divorce, the internal and a holy union for life kind of has been changed. Secondly, by allowing remarriage after widowhood or even after divorce by the statute, the concept of holy union of body and the mind has been shattered. So this is a argument given in by a lot of people who would kind of support the Hindu Marriage Act. And so when we look into the amendment of act is also positive in the sense it kind of improved the life of the widow. It allowed them to kind of enter into a remarriage. So when kind of not kind of arriving at a judgment of whether marriage as a sacrament is beneficial or marriage as a contract is beneficial for individual and society, what we are trying to do is trying to understand how this transformation has taken place, and the whole idea is that there is no kind of an evolutionary or a single line of change or a kind of a very rampant change from sacrament to contract. The third change which brought in by the Hindu Amendment Act was that element of sacred ceremony has still been retained. although its religious aspect is of least importance. So when this is kind of when we will be looking on later, that though now we kind of have marriage being negotiated in the court, even then if we kind of very kind of look around, we see that even after a court registered marriage, people go on to a mandir, or they kind of have some act of religion which will then bring back the act of sacrament. So when we try to understand by looking into the changes in Hindu marriage law and what the transformation in society, we kind of understand that though marriage is not a kind of a complete contract, but it is a kind of a peculiar contract, no doubt. So let us understand what a contract would mean according to the Indian Contract Act 1872. Section 2H says that contract is defined as an agreement enforced by law. So the first feature is the role of the law becomes it has to be legally settled. So two individuals entering into a kind of a written document is not a contract. The state or the legal body has to come in. To make an agreement enforceable by law, 4 conditions must be satisfied. So some consideration, competence of parties. So both the parties should have been at kind of some amount of competency has to be there. So some amount of parity has to be there before a contract can be entered. Free consent of parties and lawful objective. So the consent, competency and legal element. 3 elements would define whether union between or kind of an act between 2 individuals can be determined or described as contract. 2 elements of a contract are an agreement and enforceability by law. And so if we look now an agreement, so most of the time the individual consent, whether even when it is negotiated at the community level, has come in, and enforceability by law, we now are very aware that in most of the state we kind of, even if there is a community marriage, we need a marriage certificate. So even if it is a kind of through rituals, through ceremony, the role of law as kind of sanctifying the union is very kind of becomes significant. So on this analogy, marriage has 3 elements: proposal, engagement of betrothal and marriage ceremony. Marriage is a specific type of contract, cannot be allowed to end like an ordinary contract. So that is why we are kind of calling it as a peculiar contract. It is a contract, but all the elements of a contract as defined in the Contract Act would not be found, but certain elements are certainly there. In the language of a civil contract, if one takes marriage gift as consideration, competence to marry under relevant section of personal law becomes valid for both the spouses, and marriage does not become a contract enforceable by law till a religious ceremony is conducted. So both the thing is, if it is kind of done through religious ceremony, so then you need a sanctification by law, and if it is a legal marriage or a law marriage, yet you need a ritual sanctification. And that is why we kind of will come to understanding what Patricia O'Brien is telling, that it is kind of has elements of both contract and sacrament. The Supreme Court of India has held that marriage under Hindu law is a sacrament, and every personal law, it is a sacred institution which needs to be preserved and respected. In the Contract Act 1872 under section 11, a contract or of a minor of a person unsound mind is void. This element becomes very important because earlier people could also get married with those who were mentally unstable. But now, because of the Hindu Marriage Act, if there is a marriage which is negotiated with a person who is unsound mind, so the element of contract says that both the parties should be competent. So on the ground of competency, then the marriage can be declared as null and void. So, however, under Hindu Marriage Act 1955, although age of spouse and soundness of mind of marrying spouses are essential conditions for valid marriage. So, we know that there is an age of marriage which is very significant. So, we kind of have no place for a legal marriage to of children to take place. So, if we kind of need to go to the court for kind of any resolution to the marital dispute, the marriage has to be, the married couples have to be within the age. And the second condition is that it has to be the both party of both individual has to be of competent condition, or they had to be in a sound mind. So if any of these conditions are kind of missing in the marriage negotiation, then it kinds of considered as violation of the contract and does not make the marriage void, but only voidable under the section 12 of the Act. In a way, when we are talking about the Hindu Marriage Act and we are saying that there is a lot of changes which is kind of diluting the sacrament, at the same time when it is being said that it is declaring it as voidable, not only as void, then the idea, the whole question of whether you are going to declare it as a null and void will depend on the parties who has entered into it. So some amount of sacrament is being maintained. So marriage is seen as an unusual contract between two people of opposite sex bound by religious ceremony and endorsed by the state. It is a lifelong arrangement. When we look into this definition, there is again kind of a limitation to it, because certain forms of marriages are ignored, and especially when we look into the same sex marriage or when we look into kind of same sex or homosexual relation, it becomes problematic. So now when we have understood both element of sacrament and contract, we kind of understand that both are kind of available. So a general assumption that shift from tradition to modernity implies a shift from sacrament to contract is incorrect. We need to be careful about it. And when we look into kind of Patricia O'Broy's contribution, it kind of tells us that the change from tradition to modernity has kind of taken place. But even when we look into the traditional society, the element of contract was to some extent there, and today in modern society when we look into marriage and negotiation of marriage, the element of sacrament is present. So she speaks of universal doublespeak, and she seeks to construct the meaning of Hindu marriage in the universe of doublespeak. She does this by focusing on material of marriage, nullity and divorce. The question of marriage as a sacrament versus contract, which comes into force when we look into a lot of cases which has been discussed in terms of law, and she gives a lot of examples in her discussions. But what we need to conclude is that when we look into these court cases, when we look into the way in which has been kind of understood, we need to take a kind of a more active approach to current social problem. And in this kind of, we'll need to understand the conflict, the difference of opinion between individual, how it would contribute to the field of sociology of law when we look into how law is interpreting marriages in individuals, and also kind of are trying to understand that we need to understand resources of cultural and social analysis, in particular to Indian kinship and marriage. This is very important, that we cannot restrict ourselves to theories. We cannot have a kind of a textual understanding of family, marriage and kinship. We need to bring in empirical example. We need to understand as it is being practiced. So although a Hindu marriage has remained a purely sacramental marriage, it has also not become a contract, though it is a semblance of both. It has semblance of contract as consent as well as semblance of sacrament. In most marriages, a sacramental ceremony is necessary. So with this, I come to an end of today's lecture. Thank you.